try to make this discussion informal. Anybody who'd like to see these slides is welcome to them. They're from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're not very complicated. I'd like to start with a very short story about an actual factory that I visited recently. A very good friend of mine from days long ago is the president of a company in Los Angeles, California, that manufactures something dear to the hearts of a lot of people, hot sauce. He manufactures, it's called El Pato. It is supposed to be the first American company that started a brand that has a Spanish name. And it has, of course, a picture of a duck on it. And it's quite famous in Los Angeles, especially amongst Mexican-American families. I always like to visit his factory. He paints the big tanks to look like the cans. Probably the most valuable thing about it is the 11 acres he owns in downtown Los Angeles. But it's been there a very long time. He makes 2.5 million cans of hot sauce each month. He also makes mustard, which is sold to In-N-Out Burger, a famous Southern California burger joint, and as well as vinegar. I like to visit also to see what happens in the factory in terms of things like automation and robotics. So the last time I visited and really took a tour was about 10 years ago, and I visited last week. We have to put a hard hat on, and you have to wear something to make sure your hair doesn't fall out into the hot sauce and so on. So I put on a hairnet and a hard hat and they finally found a lab coat big enough for me, and I wandered through the factory with him, and I didn't notice. I only noticed one thing different in the last 10 years, and that was that they bought an Italian machine that actually would take the cans and, as they came out, sort them into a box and shrink wrap them. The only thing left that I didn't see that was anything that wasn't automated was when those boxes of cans come out, they're then loaded onto a pallet, which is then shipped somewhere. My guess was that his output is up maybe 30% for the same number of workers as it was 10 years ago. That's about 3% a year. Not very different from productivity growth in manufacturing generally. There weren't any robots, and there had to be someone standing there pretty much for every one of the machines. That hadn't changed at all. So there had been probably a little bit of labor saving with the packing of the cans into the boxes, but not more than 30%. And so my takeaway from that was the answer to the question is worth a little more investigation. And so I just looked at what's happened to the productivity numbers. How far did we go? Yeah, there's one. That has annualized rates, and then it also has annualized 4-quarter averages, and then it also has these blocks or actual annual averages. You can see productivity growth has not been very substantial in the U.S. Here's another picture of a different measure of productivity that accounts for factor inputs. And you can see, there's that one. You can see productivity growth has not been any more substantial in the last few years, been less, in fact, in some areas. The point is that there's been productivity growth in the U.S. economy for hundreds of years, and there doesn't seem to be any different about what's going on now. I remember the old quote, I kindly redid it, from Bob Solow. We see robots everywhere, except in the productivity statistics. So I looked a little more carefully at it. I think, so I'll give you a simple answer, nothing's changed in productivity growth. There isn't anything. Most of the discussion of big data, I think, big data is mainly used to figure out how to sell you things. So unless the entire GDP is going to be composed of advertising, I don't think there's that much in big data either. It might be helpful for research, but of course, people like me doing program evaluation, as you mentioned, I've been using big data for so long that it's hard to even tell, actually, almost 50 years perhaps. So there isn't, I don't think there's anything really new in any of that. Most of it is hype, and certainly nothing in the productivity figures. There is one thing that's changed, and I looked at this a little more carefully. Changed from the time that Bob or Ed or Ann or any of us were in graduate school. Maybe not Matt, he's younger. And that is that it used to be just an absolute identity that real wage growth was equal to productivity growth. I wrote down models in which productivity growth is exogenous, so if you can explain wage growth, you can explain price growth, or whatever, however you want to do it. But basically, that was more or less an identity. And of course, that stopped. That's no longer true. And it stopped in the early 1970s. So that productivity growth doesn't equal real wage growth anymore. And I think that's pretty well known. It's very unclear exactly why that is. There's two things at issue. Let me just show you, first of all, the facts. That's the blue, the dark blue is the productivity growth by sector. So here I try to do it by sector. BLS kindly provides that data. And then the little light blue is the real wage growth in those sectors. It shouldn't, I mean, what we should expect would be that the light blue numbers would all be sort of the same, because any productivity growth in the aggregate economy should presumably result in real wage growth everywhere, not just in those sectors that have more productivity. And that's sort of true. That's not exactly true. And there are other reasons why real wage growth wouldn't be the same in each of those sectors. And of course, productivity growth is dispersed. That's also a Solo's point, which he made in an early paper, different in different sectors. So the fact that this all aggregates together to get productivity equal to real wage growth isn't necessarily a guaranteed fact. It certainly isn't, no longer true. Now, there are two reasons to be a little bit suspicious of, let me show you the picture. There's a nice little picture. That's not a regression, by the way. That the red line is just goes through the unit point. And so it's just, what it tells you is these are all the sectors that they have. If compensation growth were equal to productivity growth in a sector, all the points would lie on the line. You can see, generally speaking, productivity growth is greater than compensation growth in most sectors. Now, there are two reasons to be suspicious about this. The first is that when we write down that, by the way, the other thing that's true is I'll explain why it isn't really true, but it's sort of true, is that if productivity growth doesn't equal real wage growth, then labor's share will be changing. Either it becomes bigger or smaller. When productivity growth is greater than labor share, then, greater than real wage growth, then labor share declines. And that's certainly true in these data. There is a problem with that, however, and the problem is this. Real wage growth is the price deflator for real wage growth is the consumer price index, is what workers pay for their stuff. But the price deflator for output, of course, is what producers get when they sell the stuff. So it turns out that you can just think of decompose any real wage growth difference into two parts. A change in labor share of the output they produce, value of the output they produce, measured at producer prices, and plus the change in the difference in the deflators. So if consumer prices are going up faster than producer prices, then labor share then real wage growth will be less than productivity growth. And likewise, if labor share is going down, then real wage growth, real wages will grow less at a slower rate than productivity. So you can actually decompose these sectors, and Oh, what in the world is that? Oh, wait, sorry. Well, I guess I'll get to that. Oh, yeah, so here's the picture of when you actually do it using real wage growth compared to producer price index. You can see they do fall in a line pretty much. This is an example of the decomposition. So this is for one sector. The productivity growth is on the top. The real wage growth measured in CPI numbers and consumption prices are in the bottom. And the one in the middle is real wage growth measured in producer prices. So you can see about half of the productivity growth is accounted for by labor's share change, and the other half is accounted for by the difference in these deflators, by the change in the growth of the deflators. That's actually the breakdown right there. You can see it varies all over the place. Light blue is the component which is accounted for by the difference in the growth of deflators, and you can see it's about half. Roughly speaking, people think half of the gap between real wage growth and productivity growth is due to differences in the growth of deflators. That has changed slightly. I'll give you one more picture. So that labor in the latter half of the period that we were looking at earlier, from 85 to 2015, in the latter half, more of it is attributable to labor's share declining. Now let me just take, and then I'll open to anybody that wants to talk about it later, open this to, why is this? One interpretation, Paul Krugman, for example, is that labor's share has declined because the bargaining power of labor has decreased. Actually, that's a topic that I've been working on recently. It is true that the Americans are not very pro-labor. So we have seen we now have seen several very explicit examples of collusion amongst employers to suppress wages. This was done in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, you probably heard of him, and George Lucas got together to suppress wages in the animation industry. We know that's a fact. Jobs admitted it. And there are some other examples. Some of them are a little bit more complex than you realize. For example, in a franchise company, a McDonald's in New York is not supposed to hire anybody from another McDonald's. They actually have it written into their franchise agreement. They won't do that. It's unclear the legality of that, but it has been going on for at least 30 years. So there is a sense in which you can actually point to facts that are related to failures of competition in the labor market. Of course, there are the other obvious facts. One is that we don't really have trade unions anymore in the private sector. They're at well below 7% unionized, which would be quite different for most of Europe, and even Canada, for that matter. So there are lots of symptoms of lessened competition. There are other explanations. Capital, for example. Maybe we don't have as much capital as we think because depreciation has increased. Everybody wants me to get a new computer every 5 minutes. I still use a BlackBerry. I will challenge anybody in this room to type a message as fast as I can on my BlackBerry. There has been no productivity growth with the use of iPhones at all. We don't know for sure. Maybe there really isn't we have to spend a lot more on capital in order to keep it going because depreciation has changed. And then there's the question of the deflators. And frankly, I was surprised by that, to see such long-term gaps in the input price deflator and the consumer price deflator. Obviously, when I was studying economics, that was not true. Those deflators must have been growing at the same rates. That's why we saw productivity growth equal to real wage growth. But that doesn't seem to be the case now. One interpretation is that the CPI's measurement, that the way that producer prices are set up, it's virtually impossible to measure some of the things that people who consume take for granted as being important. I don't mean just things like housing, where you can argue about the best way to deal with a price deflator for housing, but also things like medical care, which are a substantially rising fraction of expenditures in the U.S., and especially in this crowd, none of us being really young. So it may be that's one of the reasons for the gap, in which case that thinking of labor share the way we used to is probably not really as appropriate as it used to be.